Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I'm just sitting here drinking my morning coffee, getting ready to get my day started, get some squatting going. Um, and I've had a couple people, because everyone saw it yesterday, really high views so far, like 2,000 likes on it. I did my curls yesterday shortlist, and I think some people were surprised at how I looked. There were a handful of negative comments, but hundreds of very positive comments. And I've had a few people ask me, you really have that thick look. How does someone develop that? How do you develop a thick, powerful physique? That's a good question, and I think there's a couple different ways to look at that. And it's because historically there have been two types of physiques over in the physique world, which is not really my thing. I care more about strength athletes, things like that. Historically, even what bodybuilders have always called the two types of physiques are the Apollyon look, what people think of as the ultra aesthetic look, and then the Herculean physique. Those are more of the classic names for these things. Those are the classic names. Now you're seeing guys talk the difference now about aesthetics being very aesthetic versus being just thick and big. And so people are calling it the bear physique, the bear mode, which kind of comes from the gay world, and then they would call the others maybe twinks if they're skinny and small. I think that's how that works. I'm also hearing people call the other look like orc mode. There's a few things calling it that in forums and other stuff that I'm reading around looking at. And what you generally see, most larger strength athletes, or large relative to their height, because they don't necessarily have to be big in stature, tend to have that Herculean thick look. And a lot of it has to do with training just for show muscles versus go muscles. In other words, are people chasing to be really, really lean and focusing on certain muscle groups with a heavy emphasis that you can generally see from the front, but when a person turns to the side or the back, they kind of disappear. And that's a big difference that can be seen in the way people train. Now, I do want to point out there are genetic differences. There are guys who train due to their structure. They're just really thick, really big, gain muscle easily, big bone structures, are going to tend to look more like the Herculean, even if they try to train for that Apollyon look. Particularly when they're carrying more body fat. And there are people who train the latter way who still have that V-taper, narrow waisted look and everything, especially when they're leaner. And people I can think of off the top of my head, I mean, like someone I've mentioned before, a coach who I've shouted out a few times because he works with men and women, bikini people, figure people, power lifters. He's a power lifter, and he goes months at a time only doing 4 exercises. And the 4 exercises he picks, he should have that look, but he still tends to have kind of that Apollyon look. And it's like Russell Taylor. But these are kind of outliers on the two extremes. Sometimes your genetics are going to be unavoidable for this stuff. But if you want to train for that thick look to where you turn to the side and you look big, you look thick, you have to train a certain way for that to facilitate that. And the difference has to do when people say, okay, they want to impress people. Well, here's what I would say. If you want to impress people on photos, when you're just standing by yourself, yeah, you can train for the show muscles. You can train for pecs, side delts, biceps, abs, and just diet down really lean. And you'll have that look from the front. But if you want to actually have people in person say, man, this guy's big, this guy's thick, when you're not just there with a camera on you to where you can create an illusion, when you actually have to stand next to other people or people see you in person, as far as just creating that really thick look, you're going to need to train the other way. So it comes down to what is it you're trying to do. And there's a lesson to be learned here when you look at strength athletes. Strength athletes in general, don't care whether it's Olympic lifters. I mean, Dmitry Koklov has that look, right? He has that look. Even though he somewhat looks aesthetic, he still has that thick Herculean look. Most power lifters have that look, and again, depending upon their degree of body fat, tend to lean in that direction. You see strength athletes, strongmen, everyone else having that really thick look. And a lot of it has to do with building certain muscles. It has to do with your erectors, your mid-traps, your glutes, your core, your upper back. All of those things are what create that look, particularly when you turn to the side. Because someone who only trains just their pecs, and their lats for the most part, or maybe their upper traps as far as muscles that turn to the side, they will not be anywhere near as thick as someone who has built up tremendous erectors, mid traps, things like that. And a lot of that has to do with doing a lot of heavy pulling from the floor and a lot of big movements that require a lot of stabilizing. In other words, standing on your feet. Standing on your feet to do stuff. But a lot of it has to do with how much emphasis you put on things like rows and deadlifts versus exercises like lat pull downs and things where you're just trying to work your lats. In other words, if the bigger movements you can do, the more thickness you're going to develop. So in other words, if someone is trying to maximize size and get really thick and they say, man, my pecs are lagging, well, if you want to create that thick look, you wouldn't necessarily do a fly for that. You would say, well, how can I just thicken my whole torso up? You might do a weighted dip. I mean, a weighted dip is a perfect exercise for helping create that thick look because it's a chest movement and tricep movement and delt movement that works the core, that works a lot of the back, works the lats, all of that stuff also to a large extent. Instead of a lat pull down, doing a chin up. Because again, it works a lot more muscles, works the upper chest, gives you a stretch in the triceps. So again, you're creating that thicker look from the side because you're building up all those other muscles. But again, a heavy emphasis on rows and deadlifts, squatting, things like that help create that look also. Because again, from the front, things like your upper traps, your side delts, your chest, that's what matters, biceps. But when you turn to the side or the back, particularly for that thickness, that middle trap and the erectors underneath it matter. And if you're running around trying to isolate muscles all the time and trying to just bring up weak points instead of just adding overall mass with exercises that hit all of those things, you are not going to be as thick. And that's one of the big characteristic differences you can tell between someone who really trains the big strength movements versus someone who does a lot of fluff and pump. Or a lot of weak point specialization for the show muscles instead of the go muscles. When they turn to the side, you can see the difference. And it has to do with that thickness you have from the side. And that affects you from the front to some extent too, because things like the lats and everything else can be seen to some extent from the front. But again, we come down to, do they just have a V taper versus do they have a really thick chest and back, front to side. So again, what I would tell people, the best way to build that look is to focus on building as much muscle as humanly possible through your body at any given time. And that means focusing almost entirely on the big lifts. Because again, if you come back to it and you have something that's a weak point you want to bring up, why would you only work that point when you could just be building more overall muscle? Fine, put more focus on a compound movement that brings that muscle in more, so that you continue to develop everything else overall, but maybe also put a little extra work where you want it. And that's the difference in the mindset of training to do these things. But what I would say is most important is pulling weights off the floor. So again, rows, cleans, deadlifts, putting a heavy focus on that stuff. So again, also you build your forearms up, not using straps so that you build big forearms, grip strength, all of that stuff. But all of those sort of exercises tend to build those areas up. Putting a heavy focus on those is the best way to get there. And always focusing on the big movements. And again, always saying, well, again, if I want more chest, maybe I should do more dips, more bench press. And a lot of it has to do with building an upper chest. But the best way to build an upper chest is, again, a lot of overhead pressing. I mean, incline works too, but overhead pressing tends to work really well for this same endeavor also, because it builds the entire shoulder girdle, helps build the upper back, builds the traps. I mean, overhead pressing is one of the best upper trap exercises, but it builds the entire shoulder girdle. Builds the entire shoulder girdle along with the upper chest, triceps, all of that stuff. And if you're doing it standing, it helps build more core, all of those things. Again, any sort of pulling from the floor, clean snatches, deadlifts, rows, and trying to do real range of motion on some of these exercises. That's another big kicker also. Again, you'll see guys who do rows, and one of the reasons you see a lot of guys who say, well, I do a lot of rows, and then they still don't have any development. How many of them do you see who stand over and they do half rep rows? They don't bring their elbows all the way down when they lock, or they do these even they'll do them supinated, and they're just doing this. They're doing like an 8-inch range of motion. They're not getting that stretch at the bottom. They're not bringing it all the way up. Again, long range of motion. Pin lay rows are good for this because, again, you can get to hold it at the bottom, get that stretch, explode. And again, any explosive movement from the floor tends to build erectors, mid traps, glutes, all of that. So put an emphasis on these big functional movements, and it will develop all of these areas because all of these different stabilizers have to be worked. And that's the way to look at things. Are you picking an exercise that lets you use the most muscles through the body at any given time? And that's where your bread and butter is going to be for creating that thick look. That's how you do it. rather than just focus purely upon the show muscles. And I think that's a lot of the difference too. Again, show muscles versus go muscles. Apollyon versus Herculean, and that's a lot of what you're looking at. And not everyone wants that thick, powerful look. Some guys genuinely want that narrower, less thick look. They want that really aesthetic look. If that's what you want to do, that's fine. That's you can do what you want. Not really what I focus on here. And by that same token, if you have a really small frame, small bone structure, you're going to have that look irrespective. And that's something else people need to remember. You could train the other stuff, and if you diet down lean and you just have a small frame in general, you're still going to have that aesthetic Apollyon look anyways. So you might as well, in that case, go ahead and train to get as thick as possible, because you're probably never going to be that thick unless you spend years and years and years focusing on the big heavy compounds and maximum development. And the other thing it comes down to is looking at not being afraid to bulk, not being afraid of carrying a little bit of body fat, because if you're willing to gain a little body fat, you're going to gain muscle overall faster. And here's a big difference. A guy who's 12 or 14 or 15% body fat with the same amount of muscle mass on the same frame standing next to someone else who's 8% body fat is going to look bigger. They're going to look bigger in person next to them. The other guy, the more ripped guy, is going to look bigger in photos. But the guy who's carrying the healthy amount of body fat, who's not fat, not ultra lean, is going to look bigger and thicker overall than them when they are standing next to each other. So also just food for thought with all of this. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.